He thought he could humiliate her in front of 300 students and walk away with applause, but he had no idea that in less than 5 minutes his reputation would begin to crack. The lecture hall at Westbridge University glowed under cold white lights, rows of polished wooden seats rising like a quiet arena, as Professor Daniel Harrington stepped to the front, his tailored navy suit sharp, his silver hair perfectly in place. His presence alone commanded silence. This was a man known across campus for dismantling arguments and exposing weakness with surgical precision, and today he seemed especially eager, scanning the room slowly until his eyes landed on someone most had already ignored. Emily Carter sat in the back row, her posture straight but unassuming, a simple gray cardigan draped over her shoulders, her pen moving steadily across a worn notebook. She had been attending these lectures for weeks, quietly absorbing every word, rarely speaking, never drawing attention, and yet something about her stillness seemed to irritate him, as if her silence challenged his authority in a way noise never could. His lips curled slightly. "There you are," he said, his voice cutting clean through the air. "You've been very attentive. Why don't you contribute today?" A few students turned, smirking, already sensing what was coming. Emily looked up, her expression calm, almost distant. "I'm just here to learn, Professor," she replied softly, but Harrington was already turning to the board, chalk in handwriting, fast, deliberate strokes, symbols, and variables forming a complex equation that stretched across nearly 4 feet of blackboard. "This," he said, stepping aside, "is not part of your standard curriculum. It's a problem from my current research, something even my top graduate students struggle with." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Phones subtly lifted to record. Moments like this were rare and usually brutal. He turned back to her now with a thin smile. "Come on, Miss Carter, enlighten us." The words sounded polite, but the tone carried something sharper, something designed to corner her. Emily hesitated just long enough for a few quiet laughs to escape from the front rows. Her fingers tightened slightly around her pen. Not fear, not quite, something else, something measured. She stood slowly, the faint scrape of her chair echoing louder than expected as every eye followed her path down the aisle step by step. The room seemed to narrow, the air heavier, anticipation thick enough to feel. Harrington folded his arms, watching her approach with open satisfaction. "Take your time," he added, though the words barely concealed his intent to make this moment linger. She reached the board, the chalk resting where he had left it. For a brief second, she didn't move, and in that stillness something shifted. The whispers faded, the room holding its breath. Without knowing why, Emily lifted her hand and touched the chalk, her eyes tracing the equation, not with confusion but recognition, and somewhere deep in the silence, the first crack in Harrington's certainty began to form. Emily Carter did not rush, she did not try to impress, and that was the first thing that unsettled everyone in the room, because people expecting failure often rely on speed, on panic, on hesitation, but she offered none of that. Instead, she studied the equation as if it were something familiar, something she had seen not once, but many times before. Her fingers held the chalk lightly, yet with control, and when she finally made her first mark, it was quiet, deliberate, the faint scratch against the board cutting through the silence like a signal. A few students leaned forward, confusion replacing their earlier amusement, because this was not what hesitation looked like. This was not what guessing looked like. Each symbol she wrote connected seamlessly to the next, her movements steady, her breathing even, as if the crowded lecture hall no longer existed, as if she had stepped into a space where only logic remained. Professor Harrington shifted his weight slightly. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the small crease forming between his brows betrayed the beginning of doubt. He had expected errors, he had expected pauses, questions, perhaps even an apology, but instead he saw a structure unfolding on the board, a structure that mirrored his own reasoning, yet refined it, tightened it, corrected small inefficiencies that only someone deeply familiar with the subject would notice. The room grew quieter with every step. Emily did not look back. She did not acknowledge the audience. She simply continued line by line, transforming the impossible into something elegant, something undeniable. A student in the front row slowly lowered his phone, no longer recording for entertainment, but watching with genuine attention. Another whispered under his breath, "That is actually right." But no one responded because no one wanted to break whatever was happening in that moment. Harrington uncrossed his arms, now his posture no longer relaxed. He stepped closer to the board, his eyes scanning her work, faster, then slower, tracing each transformation, searching for the mistake that would restore his control, but it did not appear. Emily paused for a brief second her eyes narrowing slightly not in confusion, but in recognition of something deeper, something hidden within the equation, and then, without hesitation, she reached up and erased a small section of his original work. The sound of chalk brushing away chalk echoed louder than it should have, and a ripple of tension passed through the room. Harrington froze mid-step, his voice catching before it could form a protest, because in that instant he saw it too, the flaw, subtle but critical, the kind of oversight that could only be revealed by someone who understood not just the problem, but the foundation beneath it. Emily rewrote that portion. Cleaner, sharper, more precise than before, and when she continued, the solution aligned perfectly, the logic flowing, without resistance, without contradiction, as if it had always been meant to be written this way. A long silence followed, not empty, but heavy, filled with realization. Harrington opened his mouth, then closed it again, his certainty slipping through his fingers for the first time in years. The authority he carried so effortlessly began to feel fragile, and at the center of it all, Emily Carter stood calm, composed, as if none of this was unexpected, as if she had known all along exactly where this path would lead. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the lecture hall, like something alive pressing against every person in the room, because what they were witnessing was no longer a simple solution, it was something far more unsettling. It was precision beyond expectation. Emily Carter stepped back, just slightly, her eyes scanning the full equation one last time, not for approval, not for validation, but for completeness, and when she nodded almost imperceptibly, it was not a gesture for the class, it was a quiet confirmation to herself that everything was exactly where it needed to be. A student near the center swallowed audibly, another shifted in his seat, the earlier smirks long gone, replaced by a tension none of them could explain. Professor Harrington stood only a few feet away, now close enough to see every detail, every line, every correction, and yet for the first time in his career, he hesitated, not because he did not understand what was on the board, but because he understood it too well. He recognized the elegance of the transformation, the way she had not only solved the problem, but refined it, removing inefficiencies he himself had overlooked. And that realization settled heavily in his chest. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. You corrected the boundary condition, he said slowly, as if testing the words. Emily turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged. It was inconsistent with the initial assumption, she replied calmly, and the simplicity of her explanation made it worse, not better, because there was no arrogance in her tone, no attempt to challenge him, no need to prove anything. She was simply stating a fact. Harrington looked back at the board again, his fingers twitching slightly, as if he wanted to reach out to rewrite something, to reclaim control, but there was nothing left to fix. The logic held perfectly. A low murmur began to rise from the back of the room, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the kind of sound that forms when people realize they have misjudged something completely. One student whispered, "That is not even in the published literature." Another shook his head, slowly, unable to look away. Emily placed the chalk gently on the ledge, the soft click echoing far louder than it should have, and for a moment she remained there, not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone who had finished what was asked of her. Harrington took a step back, the movement small, but symbolic, the distance between them no longer defined by authority, but by something far more fragile, uncertainty. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to question, perhaps to challenge, but the words did not come, because every argument he could form collapsed the moment it met the clarity of her work, and in that space where his voice should have been, the room fell completely silent again, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of realization. Emily finally turned fully, her gaze steady, meeting his, not with defiance, but with calm understanding, and in that brief exchange something shifted irreversibly, not just for him, but for everyone watching, because they were no longer seeing a quiet woman at the back of the room. They were seeing someone who had just redefined the boundaries of the space she had been invited into, and as she took a single step away from the board, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air long after her movement ended. No one clapped, no one moved, and that was how everyone knew something irreversible had just happened, because applause would have been easier. It would have given them a way to release the tension, to pretend this was just another impressive moment. But silence demanded acknowledgement. Professor Harrington stood there longer than he intended, his eyes still fixed on the board, as if staring hard enough might reveal a mistake he could claim as his own victory. But the symbols remained unyielding, precise, almost unforgiving, and for the first time in years he found himself searching not for an answer but for Footing his voice when it finally returned carried none of its usual sharpness. Where did you learn to do that? The question hung in the air, stripped of its authority. Emily Carter paused mid-step, her hand lightly brushing against the edge of a desk. As she turned back toward him, the room leaned in again, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to respect. I have studied it for a long time, she said simply, and again the answer felt heavier than it sounded because it carried no explanation. No attempt to impress, just truth. Harrington nodded slowly, though it was unclear whether he was acknowledging her or conceding something deeper. His gaze dropped briefly to her notebook, still resting on the back desk, its pages filled with tightly written equations, notes layered over notes, evidence of hours, days, perhaps years spent in quiet work, unnoticed, unrecognized. He inhaled, as if preparing to reclaim control of the room, to reshape the narrative into something that still belonged to him, but the words refused to align the way they always had before, because now everyone in that room had seen what he had seen, and that could not be undone. A student in the front row finally shifted forward, raising his hand hesitantly. Professor, is her solution correct? The question was careful, respectful, but it landed with unmistakable weight. All eyes returned to Harrington, waiting not for dominance, but for honesty. He looked at the board again, then at Emily, then back to the equation, as if delaying the inevitable. And when he finally spoke, it was quiet, but clear. Yes, it is correct. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the kind of reaction that comes when something expected to collapse instead stands stronger than anything before it. Emily did not react. She did not smile. She did not acknowledge the shift. She simply inclined her head slightly, as if the moment required nothing more, and began to walk back toward her seat. Each step measured the same way it had been when she walked to the front. But now every eye followed her differently, not with judgment, but with recognition. Harrington watched her go, and something in his posture softened, not weakness, but awareness, the kind that comes too late to prevent change. As Emily sat down, she opened her notebook again as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Her pen, moving quietly across the page, the room remained still for several seconds longer, until the weight of the moment finally forced the world to continue, but it did not return to what it had been before. Because now every student in that lecture hall understood something that could not be unlearned, and at the center of it all sat a quiet woman who had never needed their attention to prove exactly who she was. The lecture continued, but it no longer belonged to Professor Harrington, not in the way it had just minutes before, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of that room, something no syllabus could account for. He returned to the board, attempting to resume his explanation, his voice steady, but lacking the edge that once controlled every second of attention. As he spoke, a few students still listened, but many were no longer focused on him, their eyes drifting instead toward the back row where Emily Carter sat quietly as if nothing had happened, her pen moving across the page with the same calm rhythm as before, as though solving a problem that had unsettled an entire lecture hall was no more significant than taking notes in silence. A student near the aisle leaned toward his friend, whispering, "That does not make sense. She is not even in the program." Another responded softly, "Maybe that is the point." The murmurs were subtle, but they carried a new tone, not mockery, not doubt, but curiosity, mixed with something deeper, respect. Harrington paused mid-explanation for a fraction of a second longer than usual, catching the shift in attention. Though he did not turn his head, he could feel it, the subtle pull of focus away from him towards someone who had not asked for it, and that awareness lingered with every word he spoke. He adjusted his posture, straightening slightly, reclaiming what control he could, but the confidence now required effort rather than instinct. After several minutes, he set the chalk down and turned to the class. "Any questions?" He asked, the same phrase he had used countless times before, but this time it did not carry the same certainty of silence. Instead, a hand rose from the middle rows, not hesitant, but deliberate. "Professor, could you explain why her correction worked better than the original assumption?" The room went still again, not with shock, but with expectation, because now the standard had changed. The question was not challenging his authority directly, but it forced him into a position he had not occupied in years, one where he had to acknowledge another perspective. Harrington looked at the student, then slowly back at the board, his eyes tracing the corrected section, his own work, now divided clearly into before and after. He inhaled, choosing his words carefully. "The original model assumed stability at the boundary," he said slowly, "but that assumption introduces inconsistency under certain conditions." He paused briefly, then added, "Her adjustment removes that inconsistency. The admission was measured, controlled, but undeniable, a quiet wave of realization passed through the room, the kind that does not need volume to be understood. Emily did not look up. She did not react to the discussion unfolding around her, as if the moment no longer required her presence to validate it, because the work itself had already done that. Harrington glanced toward her once more, not openly, not for long, but enough to register something he had not noticed before. Not her clothing, not her quiet demeanor, but the depth behind her stillness, the kind that could not be taught in a lecture hall, the kind that came from years spent outside of recognition. And for the first time, the question forming in his mind was no longer how to challenge her, but how he had failed to see her at all. The class moved on eventually, as all things do, but the rhythm was different now, slower, more deliberate. Every explanation weighed against what had just occurred, every assumption silently questioned, and at the back of the room, Emily Carter continued writing as if she had always belonged there long before anyone else realized that. The final minutes of the lecture passed in a quiet tension that no one dared to break, because something fundamental had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain it. Professor Harrington continued writing on the board, but his movements were no longer fluid. Each line carried a pause, each explanation seemed to measure itself before being spoken, as if he was now aware that every word could be weighed against a new standard, one that had not existed before this moment. And in the back row, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been before, calm, focused, her pen moving steadily across the page, her presence no longer invisible, yet still untouched by the attention that had found her. A student near the front finally raised his hand again, this time with less hesitation and more purpose. Professor, he began, his voice steady. How did she recognize the inconsistency so quickly? The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an attempt to understand something beyond the lesson. Harrington turned slowly, the chalk resting between his fingers, his eyes drifting briefly toward Emily before returning to the class. That level of recognition, he said carefully, comes from extended exposure to the problem space, not just learning formulas, but understanding the structure beneath them. His voice was controlled, but there was something different now, something almost reflective. Another student leaned forward. So she has seen problems like this before. Harrington paused again, and this time the silence stretched longer. Because the answer was no longer simple, it suggested something he had not considered, something that did not fit into the neat hierarchy he had always relied on. It suggests, he said finally, that she has studied far beyond what is expected in this room. A soft murmur followed, not loud, but thoughtful, the kind of sound that comes when assumptions begin to unravel. Emily did not look up. She did not acknowledge the conversation, as if it belonged entirely to them and not to her. Because for her, the work had never been about recognition, it had always been about understanding. Harrington set the chalk down slowly, and for a moment, he simply stood there facing the board, the equation still visible, divided between his original approach and her correction, a quiet reminder of what had just occurred. He turned back to the class and closed his notes without announcement, signaling the end of the lecture earlier than expected. No one moved immediately, no chairs scraped, no voices rose, because leaving now felt different than it had before, as if stepping out of that room meant carrying something with them, something they had not anticipated when they walked in. Emily closed her notebook, gently placing her pen inside. With the same care she had shown in every movement, she stood and gathered her things without urgency, without hesitation, and as she stepped into the aisle, the room instinctively made space for her, not out of instruction, but out of recognition. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps soft against the floor, yet somehow louder than anything that had been said. Harrington watched her as she moved across the room, not openly, not with the authority he once carried, but with a quiet awareness that something important had just passed through his classroom without announcement, without permission. And as the door closed behind her, the room remained still for one last moment, because everyone understood that what they had witnessed was not just a solution to a problem, but a shift in how they would see things from that point forward. And in that lingering silence, the weight of that realization settled deeper than any lecture ever could. The hallway outside the lecture hall felt different the moment Emily Carter stepped into it. The noise of distant conversations and footsteps echoing against polished floors seemed almost disconnected from what had just taken place behind those closed doors. She walked at the same steady pace, her expression unchanged, her mind already moving past the moment, as if it had been nothing more than a brief interruption in her routine. But behind her, the door opened again, and voices followed, not loud, but urgent fragments of disbelief, curiosity, questions that no longer had easy answers did. You see that someone whispered she rewrote his entire assumption. Another voice added she did not even hesitate. Emily did not turn around. She did not slow down, because she had heard those tones before, not in this place, not in this context, but in the quiet corners of her life, where recognition arrived late and often left just as quickly as it came. She reached the end of the hallway and paused near a window, sunlight filtering and casting soft reflections across the floor. For a brief second she allowed herself a breath deeper than the rest, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her notebook as if grounding herself in something familiar. Inside the lecture hall, Professor Harrington remained still longer than the students expected, his hand resting on the desk, his gaze unfocused, not on the board, not on the empty seats, but somewhere in between, as if replaying the moment again and again, searching for the exact point where certainty had slipped from his control. A student approached him cautiously. "Professor, do you know who she is?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Harrington blinked once, as if returning from a distance, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said, and the admission felt heavier than any answer he could have given. Another student spoke up. "She has been sitting in the back for weeks. I thought she was auditing." Someone else added, "Maybe she is a graduate student from another department," but none of the guesses settled because none of them explained what they had seen. Harrington straightened slightly, his usual composure returning in fragments, but something remained different, something quieter, more measured. "Gather your notes," he said calmly. "The next lecture will continue as scheduled." The words were routine, but the room no longer responded in routine ways. Students moved slower, their conversations softer, their focus fractured between what had been planned and what had actually happened. And as they began to leave, Harrington turned once more toward the board, the corrected equation still visible, the contrast between his original work and hers impossible to ignore. He reached for the chalk, then stopped, his hand hovering midair before lowering it again, because erasing it now would not erase what it represented. Outside, Emily resumed walking, her steps light but purposeful. As she exited the building, the late afternoon air greeted her with a calm that the lecture hall had not offered. She did not look back. She did not check if anyone followed, because she already knew something had changed, not in her, but in them, and that was never something she had needed to chase. As she disappeared into the flow of the campus, the echoes of that room remained behind, lingering in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment when silence spoke louder than authority, and understanding quietly took its place. By the time the campus settled into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon, the story had already begun to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but in fragments carried through conversations in hallways, study groups, and whispered exchanges between students who could not quite let go of what they had seen. It was not just the solution that stayed with them, it was the way it had happened, the calm, the precision, the complete absence of hesitation, as if the moment had never been a challenge at all, but something inevitable. Emily Carter moved through the campus unnoticed once again, her gray cardigan blending into the soft colors of the buildings around her, her pace unhurried, her focus unchanged. As she reached a small bench near the mathematics building, she sat down, opening her notebook to the same page she had been writing on before the lecture, her pen touching the paper, without pause, continuing a line of thought that had clearly begun long before anyone in that lecture hall had realized it existed across campus. Inside his office, Professor Harrington stood by the window, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his desk, the late sunlight casting long shadows across stacks of papers and open textbooks. Yet his attention was not on any of them. Instead, his mind returned again and again to the board, to the correction, to the quiet certainty in her voice. He walked back to his desk and opened a folder containing his current research notes, flipping through pages filled with equations, annotations, revisions, each one representing hours of focused work. And as his eyes scanned the familiar lines, something unfamiliar crept in, doubt, not in the discipline, not in the mathematics, but in the assumption that he alone controlled its interpretation. He stopped at the section she had corrected, his fingers tracing the margin where he had once been certain, and now he could see it clearly, the inconsistency subtle but undeniable. He closed the folder, slowly exhaling, as if acknowledging something he had resisted for far too long. A soft knock sounded at his door, breaking the stillness. "Come in," he said, his voice steady though quieter than usual. A graduate assistant stepped inside, holding a stack of papers. "Professor, some students are asking about the solution from earlier. They are wondering if you will be discussing it in the next lecture." Harrington paused, considering the question, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer now required something different. Yes, he said finally, we will revisit it, but not as originally planned. The assistant nodded, then hesitated. Do you know who she is? Harrington looked toward the window again, the question echoing the one he had already faced, and once more the answer remained the same. No, he said, but this time the word carried less uncertainty and more intention, because now it was not about what he did not know, it was about what he needed to understand. Outside, Emily closed her notebook, the page now filled with tightly written equations connected in ways only she seemed to follow. She looked up briefly, her gaze resting on the mathematics building, not with pride, not with reflection, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted inside it. Whether it would last, whether it would matter, that was not hers to decide. She stood, gathering her things as the evening light softened around her, and as she walked away, once again the campus continued as it always did, but somewhere beneath the surface something had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that those who had seen it would never quite look at things the same way again. The next morning the campus carried a quiet undercurrent that had not been there before, not visible to those who had not witnessed it, but unmistakable to those who had, because something had shifted in the way people spoke, in the way they questioned, in the way they looked. At the back row of that lecture hall, long before the class even began, students arrived earlier than usual, conversations forming in low voices, speculation moving through the room like a current. Some brought notebooks already open, others sat with a focus that had little to do with routine learning and everything to do with anticipation. When Professor Harrington entered the room, the usual immediate silence followed, but it was different now, not enforced, but chosen. His presence still carried weight, but it no longer controlled the entire space, as it once had. He placed his materials on the desk, his movements measured, his eyes briefly scanning the room, before settling on the back row, where Emily Carter sat once again, in the same seat as before, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the previous day had not altered anything for her. But the room reacted to her differently, this time subtle glances, not dismissive, but curious, respectful. Harrington picked up the chalk and turned toward the board, but instead of continuing the planned lecture, he paused for a moment longer than expected. Then he spoke. Yesterday, he said slowly, we encountered a perspective that challenged our assumptions. The words were careful, deliberate, chosen with precision, as if each one mattered more than before. A quiet stillness settled over the room, as every student listened more closely than they ever had. He began rewriting the same equation from the previous lecture, his handwriting steady, but his approach different this time, breaking down each step, not as a demonstration of authority, but as an exploration of understanding. When he reached the section Emily had corrected, he stopped, turning slightly toward the class. The original assumption here introduces an inconsistency, he said, acknowledging it openly. This adjustment resolves it. His gaze shifted briefly toward Emily, not calling her out, not placing her in the spotlight, but recognizing her contribution in a way that carried more weight than any public praise. Could the room absorb the moment in silence? Because this was something none of them had expected, not the correction, not the acknowledgement, but the shift in tone. A student raised his hand. Professor, would you like her to explain it? The question hung in the air, charged with possibility, but also risk. Harrington paused again, the decision not immediate, because it was no longer about control, it was about something far more unfamiliar, humility. He looked at Emily for a brief second, and then back to the class. That will not be necessary, he said calmly. The explanation is already clear, but the way he said it carried no dismissal, no attempt to reclaim dominance, only recognition that what had been shown did not require repetition. Emily remained still, her pen moving lightly across the page, as if she were documenting something deeper than the lecture itself, something unfolding quietly beneath the surface. And as the class continued, it became clear that this was no longer just a lecture, it was a recalibration of everything they thought they understood about knowledge, about authority, and about the quiet presence of someone who had never needed either to prove her place. As the lecture progressed, something subtle but undeniable continued to unfold, not in the equations on the board, but in the way the room itself responded to them, because every explanation now carried a second layer, an unspoken comparison between what was being taught and what had already been revealed. Professor Harrington moved through the material with precision, yet there was a restraint in his delivery, a carefulness that had not existed before, as if each step was being weighed not just for correctness, but for completeness. When he paused to ask a question, this time multiple hands rose immediately, not out of obligation, But out of genuine engagement, students who had once remained silent now leaned forward, eager to participate, eager to test their own understanding against a standard that had quietly been raised. Harrington acknowledged them one by one, his responses measured, his tone steady, but no longer dismissive. When an answer fell short, he did not cut it down. Instead, he guided it, refining it, as if the purpose of the room had shifted from proving authority to building clarity. And throughout it all, Emily Carter remained in the back row, her presence constant, yet unobtrusive, her pen moving in steady lines, capturing not just the lecture, but the evolution of it. A student sitting 2 seats away from her hesitated for several seconds before finally speaking quietly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, but not low enough to escape notice. Emily looked up, her expression calm. "Yes," he asked, "would you mind explaining how you saw the inconsistency yesterday?" The question was careful, respectful, carrying none of the earlier assumptions. She paused for a brief moment, not out of reluctance, but out of consideration. Then she turned her notebook slightly toward him, the equations inside layered with notes, arrows, connections that extended beyond the single problem. "You have to look at what the assumption ignores," she said softly, "not just what it includes." Her finger traced a line across the page, showing where the structure began to break down. "If the boundary condition does not hold under variation, the entire model becomes unstable." The student nodded slowly, his eyes widening as the logic settled in place. "It is not about solving faster," she continued, "it is about seeing where it fails." He thanked her, quietly returning to his notes with a focus that had not been there before, and for a moment the exchange remained contained between them, unnoticed by most, but not by all. Harrington's gaze passed briefly over the back row, catching just enough of the interaction to understand what was happening. He did not interrupt, he did not call attention to it. But something in his expression shifted again, not discomfort, not resistance, but recognition that learning in that room was no longer flowing in a single direction. As the lecture neared its end, he set the chalk down once more and looked out across the room, the students now more engaged, more attentive than they had ever been in his class. And in that moment, he understood something that could not be written on the board, that authority could command attention, but it could not create understanding. And as the bell rang, signaling the end of the session, no one rushed to leave immediately, because they all knew that what was happening in that room was no longer just a lecture. It was something deeper, something quieter, something that could not be undone. And at the center of it all sat a quiet woman who had never needed to raise her voice to change everything around her. When the students finally began to leave the lecture hall, their conversations no longer carried the casual tone of routine classes, but instead moved with a quiet intensity, as if each word mattered more than before. Small groups formed near the aisles and along the exits, voices low but focused, discussing not just the equations but the shift they had all witnessed. Some glanced back toward the board, as if expecting the answer to change, while others looked toward the back row, where Emily Carter was gathering her things with the same calm precision she had shown from the very beginning. She did not rush, she did not linger, she simply closed her notebook and stood as if this moment was no different from any other, yet the space around her felt altered. Students who once would have passed by without notice now stepped slightly aside, creating a path without being asked, a subtle gesture, but one that carried more weight than any spoken acknowledgement. Across the room, Professor Harrington remained near the front, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his posture composed yet quieter than it had ever been. As he watched the students leave, his gaze moved not with authority, but with observation, taking in the way they spoke to each other, the way they questioned, the way their attention no longer settled automatically on him, but expanded beyond the structure he had always defined. A student approached him hesitantly. "Professor, that was different today," he said, choosing his words carefully. Harrington nodded. "Once it was," he replied, his voice measured. The student paused, then added, "Do you think she will come back?" Harrington did not answer immediately, his eyes drifting briefly toward the now empty back row, where she had sat for weeks unnoticed until she was not. And in that pause, the question revealed something deeper, not just curiosity, but a recognition that her presence had changed the room in ways they were only beginning to understand. "She tends to sit in the same place," he said finally, not as a guarantee, but as an observation. The student nodded thoughtfully before walking away, carrying that answer with more meaning than it appeared to hold. The room gradually emptied until only a few remained, gathering their belongings in silence. Harrington turned back toward the board, once more, the equation still there, untouched, the correction still visible, a quiet reminder that knowledge did not belong to one voice alone. He stepped forward, slowly lifting the eraser, but this time, he did not remove everything. He left the corrected section intact, a deliberate choice, one that would remain when the next class entered, not as a lesson plan, but as a statement that something had shifted, that understanding had taken a form no longer confined to expectation. Outside the building, Emily stepped into the open air once again, the late afternoon sun lower, now casting long shadows across the campus pathways. She walked without looking back, her pace steady, her focus already moving forward, as if the moment behind her had completed its purpose without needing to linger. And as she disappeared into the flow of students, the lecture hall behind her remained marked not by what had been said, but by what had been realized, because sometimes the most powerful change does not arrive with noise or recognition, it arrives quietly, and once it is seen, it can never be unseen. The following week, the lecture hall filled again, but this time there was no uncertainty about where attention would settle, because the shift that had begun days earlier had not faded, it had deepened. Students entered with a different kind of awareness, their conversations quieter, their focus sharper, as if they were no longer simply attending a class, but participating in something that was still unfolding. When Professor Harrington stepped to the front, he did not begin immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment longer than usual, his gaze moving across the room, not to assert control, but to take in what had changed. His eyes paused briefly at the back row where Emily Carter sat, once again her presence steady, unchanged, as if nothing outside of her own understanding had ever required adjustment. He turned to the board and began writing, but the structure of the lecture was no longer rigid. It moved with a flexibility that had not existed before, each concept introduced with space for interpretation, each step explained with an openness that invited thought rather than demanded agreement. Midway through the session, he paused and turned toward the class. "There is a difference," he said slowly, "between knowing how to solve a problem and understanding why it works." The words settled into the room with a weight that extended beyond the mathematics. He gestured toward the board, toward the section that had once revealed a flaw and now stood as a correction that had reshaped everything in this room. He continued, "We focus on solutions because they are visible, but true understanding often exists where we are not looking." A quiet stillness followed, not forced, but natural, as if every student recognized that the lesson being offered now reached beyond the equation. A hand rose near the back, not tentative, but steady. Emily Carter spoke, her voice calm and clear. "If the structure is built on an incomplete assumption, then the solution will always carry that weakness." Her words were simple but precise, the kind that did not seek attention, yet held it completely. Harrington met her gaze for a brief moment, not as an authority addressing a student, but as one mind acknowledging another. "That is correct," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no need to qualify or redirect. The acknowledgement stood on its own. The room absorbed the exchange in silence, because it was no longer surprising. It was expected, not because of her position, but because of her understanding. A student near the front leaned forward, then asked, "How do we learn to see those weaknesses?" Harrington did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted briefly toward Emily before returning to the class. "By questioning what appears certain," he said finally, "and by remaining willing to be wrong." The words carried a quiet weight that extended beyond the lecture, because they were no longer theoretical, they were lived. The remainder of the class moved with a clarity that had not been present before. Discussions, deeper questions, sharper answers, more thoughtful. And when the session came to an end, no one rushed to leave immediately, because the space had become something more than it had been before. Emily closed her notebook, once again rising with the same quiet composure as always, but this time, as she stepped into the aisle, the recognition around her was not subtle. It was understood, not expressed in words, but in the way the room acknowledged her presence, not as an exception, but as part of the foundation that had reshaped everything. And as she walked out once more, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be remembered. In the weeks that followed, the lecture hall at Westbridge University no longer felt like a place defined by a single voice, but by a shared pursuit of understanding something that had quietly taken root. The day Emily Carter stood at the board and revealed what no one else had seen. Professor Harrington continued to teach, but his presence had changed, not diminished, but refined. His words carried more intention, his pauses more meaning, and his questions no longer sought to test limits, but to expand them. The students responded in kind, their engagement deeper, their curiosity sharper, as if They had all crossed an invisible threshold together and could not return to the way things had been before. Emily remained in her seat at the back row, just as she always had, her gray cardigan blending into the quiet rhythm of the room, her pen moving steadily across her notebook, capturing not just equations, but the evolution of thought itself. She did not seek recognition, she did not invite attention, yet it followed her in subtle ways. In the respectful distance others gave, in the careful listening when she spoke, in the absence of assumptions that had once defined her presence. One afternoon, as the class came to a close, Professor Harrington set the chalk down and turned toward the room, his gaze steady, his expression composed, but carrying something unspoken. "Before you leave," he said slowly, "there is something I want to acknowledge." The room grew still, not with tension, but with quiet anticipation, because moments like this had become rare but meaningful. He continued, "Knowledge does not belong to titles or positions. It belongs to those who pursue it with discipline and humility." His eyes moved briefly toward the back row, not lingering, not isolating, but recognizing. "And sometimes," he added, "the most important insights come from where we least expect them." The words settled into the room, not as a lesson, but as a truth that had already been proven. No one spoke, no one reacted outwardly, but the silence that followed was full, not empty. Emily closed her notebook gently, as she always did. Her movements unchanged, her presence steady. She stood and gathered her things, and as she stepped into the aisle, the room responded, not with noise, but with understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps soft against the floor, yet carrying a weight that lingered long after she passed through the door. Outside, the campus moved, as it always did, students crossing paths, conversations blending into the background, life continuing without pause. But for those who had been in that room, something had shifted permanently. They would remember not just the equation, not just the correction, but the moment when certainty gave way to clarity and authority gave way to understanding. And somewhere within that memory remained the image of a quiet woman who had never needed to prove her worth, because it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And on that day, the world around her had finally caught up to what she had known all along, and the room had gone silent, not out of shock, but out of respect.